Hello and welcome into the May 22nd edition of Slick Talk. This is your host. I don't know if I can call myself Joe anymore, I'm going to be honest, because we had a comment from friend of the program and customer Lou. He thanked me for our last episode and referred to me as Blackstone Joe, and I love that for many, many reasons. I think the main one is it probably evokes more sage than I've earned in my time. I mean, I hope there's some wisdom. I've heard tell from our listeners that this has been a very informative podcast and one that really, kind of makes oil analysis approachable and understandable. So I think we're going the right place, and I'm going to go ahead and roll with that name just for Lou. And we also want to thank Lou for sending along a question for our mailbag segment. But before we get onto that, we do want to give some news and a little bit of a COVID-19 update, because I think that's always a good thing for a business to do right now. We need to keep everyone, customers and potential customers, we need to keep them informed about the goings on in the building, and we are still fully operational. No changes there. Now, there is one small caveat in that postage, which is how we get our samples in. You may be experiencing some delays as far as getting your samples in the door. We are at the mercy of the post office and USPS, FedEx, you name it, whatever logistics avenue that you go through. It's entirely possible that we are going to experience some delays in that way. But once you get the sample in the door, we are still working on our typical 5-day turnaround. So expect that all of our testing will be available. We'll be sure to note that loud and clear if anything changes. But right now, Blackstone is going at full force. In fact, I was just talking to the president of the company, Ryan Stark, just yesterday, and he had mentioned that we are pretty much full up. As far as samples go, there is no shortage of testing going on in either of our labs. And one piece of news to pass along is we are continuing construction on a third lab. So the way things are set up is we have one lab that will run pretty much anything, but we have one lab that's dedicated to aircraft. And we like to keep those separate for a few reasons. We'll talk about that. Probably it's honestly a good topic for a whole show, how we have the labs set up. But yes, that is your reminder that Blackstone is here, the doors are open, and you can still send your samples in. And now it's time for our Catch Pan segment. This is going to be Blackstone's mailbag portion of the show where we answer your questions, and today we have one from friend of the program and customer Lou. And he's got a little bit of a two-parter here. He says, one of the old ones I've heard is that you must use the same brand of oil in a motor, that using a different brand or weight will affect the motor's life. Also, while we're talking about things and going the complete opposite direction, what would happen if you had different brands, not to mention weights, of motor oil and dumped them into a motor at oil change time? All right, thank you, Lou. He puts both of these questions under the heading Oil Myths and Questions, and it's certainly a common misconception, I would say right off the bat, that you can't use more than one oil in an engine, especially at the same time. Some people are even nervous about changing the oil at all. When you think about instances with, say, transmissions, I've heard, some folks, be it mechanics or just people who are amateur mechanics in their own right, will talk about fear of changing, automatic transmission fluid because they believe it's kind of like bonded to the transmission, and that if you remove it and you install another oil, that it's not going to work properly or, lubricate the same way. And really, that's not a concern. Matter of fact, getting fresh oil in a system is always good it's going to remove those metals and keep them from accumulating. It's also going to remove solids, that form normally in used oil just from oxidation. So putting in fresh oil that doesn't have metal, that doesn't have solids, is only going to do good. And it also doesn't matter if you mix those brands or blends. A normal scenario we come across, I would say I probably come across it every day, is a customer mentioning that they had to add a quart or so of, something else, something, maybe they had an oil change where they had to dump in 7 quarts of Castrol, and then, by chance they needed to add in another quart of something, maybe Mobil 1, and that's, of course, good for us to know, because sometimes when you add brands that have wildly different additive packages together, well, that can, interest us in that, we might find an element that doesn't normally show up in a given oil. So that's good to know, but certainly not a problem. You can mix various brands and blends because really, most of them look quite similar. You're going to have a really consistent layout across a lot of the various names out there, which makes sense. There's just not going to be a lot of secrets when it comes to the industry. It's safe to say that if one supplier learns of the existence of one additive or one way to make their oil, and if there's really a benefit to it, it's not going to stay a secret for long. So by all means, go ahead and mix whatever you need to. Just let us know. If we do find something interesting, we'll be sure to point it out. As far as viscosity goes, you can also feel comfortable with mixing, another viscosity. If you had 1 quart or so of 520, let's say, and your engine takes 0.20, you're probably not going to bother it, and you could even maybe get a little more ambitious with the experimentation than that. But mixing viscosity, when you're talking about grades that are pretty close together, it's really not a concern. There's just not much difference there, and the engine's probably not going to notice, to be frank. And we do see some pretty bold experimentation that proves usually successful. It's a pretty rare day that I find someone add in a let's say a 540, in a BMW. A lot of those cars are taking 1060 if you're looking at one of the V8s like the S65, S85, so on and so forth. The manual will call for 1060, and folks might experiment with a 540 or something along those lines. And really, it's a rare day that I look at one of those samples and see a drastic change in wear patterns, or anything else for that matter that would look troublesome. And that's something to really talk about in general. How do we decide if an oil is working well? In truth, we're going to want to start with how the engine is wearing, but we're also going to look to other things. We're going to see if the viscosity is staying in the expected range. Is the oil oxidizing rapidly? Is there any sign that the oil is breaking down? If you have a clean report with healthy wear levels, good physical properties, that's going to be enough to show the oil is working well. You can also go the extra mile if you're interested in how much active additive is left over. Then you can add on TBN. We can just put that in the arsenal as well. But you can count on a standard analysis telling you if that oil is getting the job done. So to sum up, in answer to both of Lou's questions, you can feel comfortable mixing different brands or blends because, again, most of them look quite similar. And even if you were to run the same specific blend over the years, it's probably going to change some. It's pretty normal to see manufacturers adjust their recipe over time. So yes, that means you could be running an oil, let's just give an example, Mobil 1. Well, the Mobil 1 recipe is probably going to vary some. We've seen changes in additive recipes pretty much across the board, over the years. So while the label and the name may look the exact same each time you buy it, there could be changes going on inside that bottle as far as what they've been producing from one year to the next. So even then, you're probably going to have different oil just under the same name. And when it comes to mixing viscosity, it's something, again, it's good for us to know, because especially if we see a viscosity that's a little low for what you typically run, but you just mentioned that, oh, well, I had to add in a couple quarts of a thinner grade. Well, good. Then that means we can have a logical explanation for maybe a reading that isn't quite in spec. But it's certainly not something that would alarm us. And if you have a really good report along with it, then you can be sure the oil worked well, regardless of maybe not having a viscosity in the expected range. All right, and that wraps up our mailbag segment. And now it's time for Can You Test It? This is going to be a reoccurring segment where we delve into really interesting samples that we've looked at over the years, add in a little context about them, do a little bit of live analysis as well, because obviously not every analyst has looked at every sample. This is one that I've always heard of, especially in training. I think it was mentioned a couple of times. When we first come in for training, it's fun to kind of dig into some of the more strange samples that we've come across. But again, not all of them are exactly etched in our memory as far as the exact data. So I wanted to pick one that I remember being talked about early on, but I didn't really remember many hallmarks of the report itself. So this is still going to be really fresh for me. But it was easy to think of this example when I was talking about putting this segment together. And this is a sample of barber chair oil. So naturally, when this sample was sent in, there was some question as to, hey, we know you're an oil analysis lab, but can you test this? And the short answer to pretty much any question like this, if it is a petroleum-based product, we can test it. Straight up. Now, the question can then become, how many of them have we seen? And, do we have experience with certain makes or models? That's always something worth inquiring, because, it's certainly possible that we haven't seen particular make or model that you're interested in testing. But if it is a petroleum-based product, then you can bet we can run our testing on it, and we can at least give you some outline about the general features of the sample. And we can at the very least talk about how it looks compared to similar makes, similar models. We can really find a comparison somehow, some way, but we also just kind of have a general rule of thumb when it comes to certain applications. So, barber chair oil. Can we test it? Yes, we can. Yes, we did. And here's a couple features of this sample. One that really screams, please talk about me, is aluminum. So aluminum is a bit of an unusual find in a hydraulic system. It might be from the housing, it could be from another part entirely, but in general what we'll see in a hydraulic sample is typically iron and copper. You might have some lead in there too. So aluminum caught our eye not just because it was present, but it was present at a whopping 910 parts per million. So the number itself may not seem, it's kind of hard to relate this if you haven't looked at a lot of reports before, if you haven't looked at a whole lot of used oil analysis in general. But a good hydraulic system, by and large, those things just don't make a lot of metal. And when I say they don't make a lot of metal, you might be talking about a range of anywhere from 10 to 20 parts per million. Maybe you'll get a little bit higher into the 30s, but, of course, we're always going to use trends to decide what's typical in the end. But starting off, a number that's well into the hundreds and approaching the thousands of parts per million is just plain unusual. And another thing that we noticed in this sample was the presence of high iron, which might be from a gear or something along those lines. But the reason the customer sent this sample in is the barber chair stopped working. This is one of those really simple chairs where you just, you step on a lever and you, it's a foot operated. It's going to go up, it's going to go down. Like that's all that's going on in a chair. So it started generating a lot of metal, clearly, and they were interested in what could be going on. And another couple of items that stood out was there was a lot of solid material, which are insolubles, and there was also the presence of silicon, a high level at that. So silicon is almost always from sealers, but it can show dirt contamination. It's just not that common in a hydraulic unit because they're closed up. So it's not like the thing has an air filter or an intake, which can be prone to allowing dirt in. So just doing some live analysis with you all. When you have a high silicon level, and then you also have some metals testing pretty high as well, well, those can be pretty clear indicators of factory oil. This is probably the oil that the chair left the factory with, and it's probably been in use for a pretty long time. And you also have those insolubles that show oxidation. So we're looking at a sample with a lot of hallmarks of factory oil that was probably left in use for too long. And when the oil is in use for too long, we talked earlier in the mailbag segment about how some people have fear of changing oil, like in transmissions, because there's some idea that the oil is supposed to mate to the machinery it's lubricating, and that if you change that out, there will be this bond that can never be won back, and the oil's not going to do what it's supposed to do. But that's not to say the owner of this chair was necessarily neglectful, but there's a lot of indicators here of an oil that was probably in use for too long. And who knows? It's possible the combination of metal and solid material, really turned that oil abrasive. And when we talk about aluminum being an unusual metal to find in a hydraulic system in general, it's possible that that metal spiked because all of a sudden a problem was generated from the oil not lubricating properly, and that kind of became a problem on top of a problem, and then we have all this metal coming from the housing or some other part. But what we have here are some pretty abnormal levels, and we do have a good feel for what hydraulic systems look like in general, and we certainly have a good feel for how much solid material a hydraulic oil can handle. And when you have a pretty high level like this, we're talking about 0.8%, and more than 0.1 can typically cause problems. And here's why. Like, a hydraulic oil is it's thin, and it doesn't have much in the way of additives or anything like that. So really, this oil can't have much going on in it. It can't handle a lot of metal. It can't handle a lot of solid material because it will quickly, break down, versus what you would get from like a gear lube, something that is much thicker and typically just used for splash lubrication. So hydraulic oil is more sensitive in that way. And I would wager that had this oil been changed sooner, we probably would have, who knows, prevented the problem that this chair had, prevented a repair. So if you're ever curious about whether or not an oil is good, you can always send in a sample. If it's convenient, do it without changing the oil and send it in, and we'll let you know if the physical properties match up with what we would expect for the fluid type. We'll let you know where metals stand, and hopefully at the very least, that can clue you into some preventative maintenance. And finally, if you ever have a sample and you're not sure if we can test it, I mentioned earlier anything petroleum based, but if you're not confident that you know what you're looking at, just give us a call and ask to speak with an analyst, and we'll be happy to walk you through what you're looking at as far as machinery, what you're hoping to learn if you're just trying to gauge if the oil's serviceable, or if you're looking for a problem. Just get us on the phone. You can also email us anytime. bstone@blackstone-labs.com is the email address, and we'd be happy to talk with you. So yeah, if you have a question about a sample, or if you just want to know how familiar are you with this given oil or this given application, those are all good questions to ask beforehand if you're curious, and that way we can be sure to tailor the analysis to your specific questions. Otherwise, we'll just give you a general rundown, let you know if anything looks like trouble. So that wraps it up for today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting Slick Talk. If you like this episode, feel free to leave a review. And always give that 5-star rating if you can. And until next time, this is Blackstone Joe signing off. God, I forgot my water. Every time I sit down, it's like, well, now I'm thirsty. Maybe not even because I'm actually dehydrated, but just because I forgot my water. It's psychosomatic.